The fog hung low over San Francisco Bay. Floodlights cut through the haze, casting long shadows over steel. It was midnight at the new Kaiser shipyard, and the air trembled. Engines coughed, cranes swung, and molten sparks rained across the decks. Men worked through the night, sleeves rolled, faces streaked with soot and oil. The war had just begun, and America was still unprepared. Germany's U-boats prowled the Atlantic. Merchant ships burned faster than they could be replaced. By winter, Britain's lifeline was collapsing beneath the waves. Washington turned to one man no one expected, Henry J. Kaiser. He wasn't a naval architect. He wasn't even a shipbuilder. He built roads, dams, and dreams out of concrete and deadlines. When the Navy asked how long it would take to deliver cargo ships, Kaiser didn't offer a number. He offered a promise. We'll build them like cars, and faster than anyone believes possible. At first, the veterans of the shipyards laughed. Shipbuilding was an art, they said, not assembly. It took 20 days on average to build one Liberty ship. Every line was hand-laid, every plate hand-riveted. But Kaiser saw something else in the smoke. He saw a factory without walls. He saw America's workers as soldiers, armed not with rifles, but with wrenches, torches, and belief. That December, the first frames rose over the Richmond mudflats. Prefabrication began, an idea borrowed from the automobile line. Sections were built separately, then joined like pieces of a puzzle. Steel met steel in rhythm, as welders stitched light into darkness. A whistle blew through the cold. Shifts changed, but the sound of progress never stopped. Women arrived in coveralls, their hair tied back with bandanas. They called themselves Kaiser's welders, and they meant it. The night smelled of ozone and wet iron. A boy barely 18 guided a torch along the hull, his breath visible against the glow. Beside him, an older man from Oklahoma steadied the beam. Neither had built a ship before, but both knew why they were there. Each rivet, each weld, was a reply to loss at sea. Each clang of steel was an echo of convoy signals over the Atlantic. The war felt distant until the telegrams arrived. Another Liberty sunk off Newfoundland. Convoy hit, heavy casualties. The news spread quietly across the work floor. No one spoke, but hammers hit harder that night. Kaiser walked to the yards at dawn, his coat soaked with mist, clipboard under one arm. He watched sparks leap from the hulls, and he smiled, not out of pride, but defiance. He knew this was no miracle. It was organization. It was faith in ordinary hands doing extraordinary work. By spring, the first Liberty ship slid into the bay. The crowd cheered as it struck water, a floating answer to an industrial prayer. From a muddy shore in California, America had begun to outbuild a war. Steam rose from the launch rail in the sea. Distance, foghorns called back through the morning. The sound carried, slow, deep, unending, into the next shift, into the next hull, into the next dawn. Steam lingered in the air as morning light broke through the cranes. The shipyard was awake before the sun. Steel plates clanged like church bells over the bay. Across the nation, new yards rose from empty fields. Portland, Baltimore, New Orleans, all humming the same song of labor. Prefabrication had escaped Richmond and become a gospel of production. Each ship was no longer built. It was assembled. Sections arrived on rail cars, painted, wired, ready to join the whole. Foremen carried blueprints like maps to an invisible front. In Portland, welders joked that a ship could be built before payday. In Baltimore, families packed lunches for fathers and daughters both. No one spoke of war fatigue, only schedules, quotas, and pride. Henry Kaiser moved between yards like a general inspecting troops. He spoke softly, always about speed and safety in the same breath. His men called him the man who believed in time. Welding replaced riveting, a quiet revolution of fire. Rivets needed teams. Welding needed trust and precision. The glow of torches danced across half-built hulls like constellations. By April, the first records were shattered. A Liberty ship built in 72 days, then 42, then 18. Newspapers printed each number like a battle victory. It wasn't just efficiency, It was morale, turned into movement. Every hour saved meant more lives carried safely across the sea. Workers slept in trailers beside the yards. Children played near rail tracks lined with steel plates. Even Sundays smelled of oil, salt, and coffee. America had become a single factory, from shore to shore. Women learned the hum of the arc torch. Farm hands learned the weight of a welding mask. Immigrants, students, and retirees all found purpose under the same roar. And through it all, Kaiser pushed the idea further. What if, he said, a ship could rise every week? Silence met the question, then laughter, then belief. By summer, the laughter stopped being doubt. In a test run at the Richmond Yard, they built the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes. Reporters timed it to the minute. Cameras flashed as workers waved from the decks, the hull still warm, steam curling from its seams. It wasn't just a ship. It was proof that industry could feel alive. Old-timers said it couldn't last. They were right. It didn't need to. It only had to outlast fear and outrun loss. The U-boats could sink steel, but they couldn't sink momentum. Each launch became a statement. We will build faster than you can destroy. As night fell, the cranes went quiet for a moment. Rain began to fall, soft, steady, metallic on the hulls. A welder stood under the downpour, staring at the next frame waiting. He whispered, almost to himself, "Tomorrow she'll have a name." The lights dimmed, but the rhythm, steel, fire, silence, kept echoing through the rain. Rain turned to mist over the Richmond docks. By dawn, the floodlights flickered back to life. Steam rose again, and with it, the sound of footsteps. Tens of thousands now poured through the gates each morning. Men from the Dust Bowl, women from textile mills, migrants from the South. Each carried a lunch pail and something harder to name, a sense that history had opened its doors, and they had been called to build freedom from the ground up. Inside the sheds, it was never quiet. The hum of welders mixed with the clatter of trolleys and chains. The air smelled of iron, grease, and salt water. But beneath the noise, there was order. A pulse that beat in unison with the tide. Supervisors timed every movement with stopwatches. Crews rotated through the night, 6-hour shifts overlapping like gears. Some slept on cots between machines, too tired to make the walk back to camp. Children grew up in trailer parks built beside the yards. They drew ships in chalk on the pavement, naming them after heroes they'd never met. Wives worked beside husbands. Riveters, inspectors, electricians. Every family became a small production line. There were injuries, and there were fears. A wrong spark could blind a man, a fall could kill him. But each morning, they returned, not for medals, but for momentum. The war posters called them the Home Front Army. Kaiser called them something simpler. The builders of peace before peace arrives. He built hospitals beside the yards, free for all workers, white or black, male or female, the first of its kind, they said. Those hospitals would later shape the model for American healthcare. Every evening, the siren marked shift's end. Some stood by the railings, watching the sun sink behind unfinished ships. Others stayed, finishing welds by lamplight, faces glowing gold beneath their masks. In one corner of the yard, a woman pinned a photograph of her brother to the hull she was welding. He was somewhere in the Atlantic on a ship like this one. She never spoke while she worked, only pressed her gloved yet to the steel before each seam. By summer, the shipyards felt like a city within a city. 24 hours of flame, noise, laughter, and loss. Church tents, canteens, baseball fields, all under the same smoke. Reporters asked how Kaiser kept morale so high. He said, "We don't build ships. We build belief, one plate at a time." That belief became rhythm, the clang of cranes, the echo of footsteps on steel decks, the soft hum of generators that never stopped. Some nights, when fog rolled in from the bay, the workers couldn't see the holes they were shaping. They worked by sound alone, by instinct. And still, the ships kept rising. By the year's end, more than 200 Liberty ships had launched. Each one carried a piece of the people who built it, their fingerprints hidden under paint, their breath sealed inside the welds. When the foghorns blew for the next launch, no one clapped anymore. They only nodded, quietly, and turned toward the next frame. The war was still raging across the ocean, but here, in the noise and heat, they had learned what endurance meant. The human engine, tireless, imperfect, unbreakable, kept turning through the night. The fog of California gave way to Atlantic mist. Cold winds carried the scent of diesel and salt. Convoys stretched across the gray horizon, rows of Liberty ships, black hulls gliding through steel-colored seas. They moved in silence, escorted by destroyers cutting white lines through the swell. Every captain knew the danger that waited below. The U-boats were patient, invisible, and close. The first Liberty convoys left Halifax in early spring, their decks stacked with munitions, grain, fuel, and hope. Each ship a floating warehouse, each crew aware that one torpedo could erase them all. Records show that by March 1942, the Atlantic had become the most dangerous ocean on Earth. Hundreds of merchantmen were already gone, smoke rising where supply once stood. But something was changing. The convoys were growing faster than the losses. Where 10 ships sank, 20 more replaced them within weeks. Kaiser's promise, unthinkable months before, was becoming real. In the North Atlantic storms, crews heard the distant hum of the new Liberty engines. They called them steel miracles, though most never saw the yards. What they felt was the heartbeat of industry, pulsing across the ocean. One radio operator aboard the SS John W. Brown wrote, "The sky is black with snow, and yet I can hear America working through the static." Convoy after convoy left the harbors, liberties numbered, painted, blessed, and sent into the dark. Their names carried cities, states, and fallen men. Each launch honored someone who wouldn't return. The U-boats kept hunting, but now the sea belonged to the builders as much as the sailors. When one ship fell, another took its place before the oil slick faded. From London, Churchill called them the bricks of freedom. From Washington, Roosevelt smiled and said, "They are the answer to the wolf pack." Numbers began to turn. In 1942, America launched one Liberty ship every 10 days. By 1943, one every 4. The line between defeat and survival was measured in welding hours. Convoy escorts changed tactics, zigzag routes, air patrols, radar pings over black water. But beneath every maneuver was the simple truth. Without Liberty ships, the Allies would starve. At night, searchlights swept across the waves. Flares marked positions of ships in trouble. The radio crackled. Coordinates, distress, silence. Some never answered again. Yet each dawn, new hulls appeared on the horizon, fresh paint gleaming where yesterday there had been smoke. They called it the Liberty Tide, a flood of steel too vast to be stopped. In every convoy photo, there's always one figure standing alone on the deck, hands in pockets, face to the wind. A man who knows he sails inside a miracle made by strangers. He cannot see the women who welded his hull, or the men who forged his anchor chain. But he trusts them, and that trust carries him through the fog. When the ships reached Liverpool, the dock workers would pause, watching the gray shapes appear through drizzle and smoke. They said the sound of Liberty engines was the sound of hope arriving on schedule. By the end of 1942, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the hunters. It belonged to those who built faster, endured longer, and believed deeper. The sea was still dangerous, but now it echoed with the rhythm of production, a pulse stretching from Richmond to Reykjavik. And under that rhythm, the war began to turn. The Atlantic winds eased by spring. Convoys now crossed faster, their wakes shimmering like silver scars on the sea. Behind them stood a nation transformed, a machine built on urgency, precision, and belief. By 1943, America had become the largest shipyard in history. 18 million workers filled factories, foundries, and docks. Steel poured by the hour, each ingot destined for the war's next vessel. Henry Kaiser's system had gone national. Blueprints from Richmond traveled to Maine, Texas, and Oregon. Every yard followed the same rhythm, a chorus of efficiency echoing across time zones. The numbers defied imagination. 2,000 Liberty ships afloat, a merchant fleet larger than the navies of most nations. Each launch felt less like celebration and more like momentum turned into muscle. Production tables showed what courage alone could not. Where one empire consumed itself in conquest, another built itself in cooperation. The Allies were no longer outnumbered. They were outbuilt. Kaiser's name appeared in newspapers beside Roosevelt's and Churchill's, but he never called it genius. He called it logistics of the heart. Men can only build this fast, he said, when they believe what they're building matters. And it mattered, to every front. From North Africa to Sicily, from the Aleutians to the Solomons, Liberty ships carried the skeleton of victory. Fuel for the tanks, grain for the starving, bombers disassembled in crates, waiting for assembly in distant skies. Every rivet in those hulls held more than steel. It held time, compressed, borrowed, and given freely. The faster the ships arrived, the slower the enemy advanced. In London, reports showed U-boat losses rising each month. The hunters had become hunted. Aircraft from newly built escort carriers shadowed convoys like guardian wings. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, now glittered with the wake of redemption. Back home, the factories glowed through the night. Workers no longer questioned if they were winning. They only asked how much faster they could go. Kaiser expanded beyond shipyards, into aluminum, aircraft, housing, and even medicine. He built without pause, as if time itself were an ally. One engineer recalled the moment clearly. "We looked at the charts," he said, "and realized we were making ships faster than the ocean could swallow them." The miracle of speed had become a doctrine of survival. Every section welded in place was a defiance of despair. Every hull sliding into the bay whispered the same quiet oath: "We will not stop." In the Pacific, the Navy began converting Liberty hulls into hospital ships, repair ships, even floating barracks. The design proved adaptable, a vessel for any purpose, born from the mind of a builder who saw possibility in pressure. By autumn, supply routes thickened like arteries of an industrial heart. Convoy losses plummeted. Factories expanded again, this time to prepare for invasion. The sound of progress was everywhere. A train whistle, a crane swing, the hum of a generator before dawn. And through it all, Henry Kaiser remained the same man who'd once stood in the fog. He still carried his clipboard through the yards, still spoke softly, still believed time could be conquered by teamwork. When asked what he thought of the Kaiser miracle, he smiled and said, "It isn't a miracle. It's what happens when people refuse to believe in the impossible." By the close of 1943, America no longer feared losing the sea. It owned the rhythm of its waves, and with it, the future of the war. The tide had turned, but for those who built it, the work was far from done. The torches burned on, lighting the path to invasion, to liberation, to the long road home. The wind over the channel smelled of salt and oil. In the half-light before dawn, the horizon flickered with ships. Liberty hulls, gray and unadorned, stretching so far they seemed to erase the sea. It was June 1904. Operation Overlord, the greatest invasion in history, was underway. Behind every warship and landing craft stood the silent armada of the builders. From the beaches of Normandy to the harbors of England, Liberty ships formed the veins of invasion. Their decks carried trucks, tanks, fuel, rations, and prayers. Every bolt tightened in Richmond, every weld sealed in Baltimore, now carried across the waves in living proof of promise. The first shells began to fall. Smoke curled into the sky, mixing with fog and diesel exhaust. Through it all, the Liberties kept coming, steady, stubborn, unbroken. The Navy called them expendable. The sailors aboard called them home. Their engines thudded like slow heartbeats under fire. Each ship carried its own small miracle, a crew who knew the odds and sailed anyway. On Deebla 3, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien unloaded ammunition under air attack. Its gunners returned fire while dock cranes still swung overhead. Shells burst nearby, raining sparks across her deck. Yet the ship never stopped unloading, a floating warehouse in the storm of history. Every convoy that reached France was a sentence written in steel by unseen hands. Workers back home followed the reports in silence, listening for the names of ships they had built. When one went down, they marked it quietly, then returned to the line before sunrise. In Normandy's shallows, liberties became breakwaters for the artificial harbors. Their captains scuttled them on purpose, turning cargo ships into shields for landing craft. They called them phoenixes, rising not from ashes, but from sacrifice. Each wreck became part of the harbor that saved the invasion. Battered hulls forming walls against tide and storm. Steel once meant for cargo, now shaped the destiny of Europe. Behind them, the supply line thickened, a constant procession of liberty ships bringing life to a dying continent. Coal, food, medicine, machines, the anatomy of liberation carried in their holds. At home, factories ran without pause. In some towns, the glow from the yards was brighter than the moon. The war had consumed everything, but creation had become its answer. By autumn, the Allies were pushing east. Each mile advanced owed itself to those gray ships that vanished into fog and returned as headlines. The convoy made it, someone whispered, and another life, another battle endured. The U-boats struck back, desperate and diminished. But they faced an ocean that no longer belonged to fear. The hunters had become the hunted, and the tide rolled over them without mercy. One captain of a liberty ship wrote home, "We don't carry glory, we carry the weight of 1,000 unseen hands." He was right. For every sailor, 1,000 builders stood behind him, their sweat and time forged into armor that crossed oceans. As winter came, the gray waters of Normandy turned calm again. Waves lapped against the rusting hulls that had formed the harbor. A gull circled above the quiet decks. The sound of war was fading, but its echo still hummed through the steel. From the mudflats of California to the beaches of France, a single rhythm connected it all. The clang of creation, the silence after thunder. And somewhere in that stillness, the world began to realize that speed alone had never built these ships. It was faith, hammered, welded, and set adrift. The sirens that once called men to their shifts now sounded for silence. The war was ending, and across the shipyards of America, the noise began to fade. In Richmond, the cranes stood still for the first time in years. Tools lay where hands had left them. The air, once alive with sparks and hammer blows, hung heavy with memory. Victory had come, but it arrived quietly, without the roar that had built it. By May 1945, the last Liberty ships were sliding into the bay. The workers gathered along the rails, caps in hand, faces lit by the low sun. Some smiled, some simply stared at the water. For many, it was the only kind of goodbye they knew how to give. Over 3,000 Liberty ships had been built, more than any fleet in history. They carried 2/3 of all cargo shipped during the war, an armada not of warships, but of will. In the end, it wasn't the engines that mattered most. It was the people who had made them run. Kaiser walked to the empty yards that summer. Grass had begun to grow through the concrete. He stopped where the first frame of the Patrick Henry once stood. The bay was calm, the fog returning like an old friend. He said little, only that the future should be built with the same urgency as survival. To him, peace was just another kind of construction. From those ideas came new hospitals, new communities, new dreams. The same systems that built ships would soon build homes and heal bodies. The war had ended. But the architecture of compassion had only begun. Back in the yards, the workers packed up their gloves, their helmets, their memories. Women who had once welded hulls returned to families, some never wanting to hear another siren again. Others stayed on, teaching what they had learned to those who would shape the post-war world. Many ships remained at sea long after the guns went silent. They carried refugees, food, and the remnants of empire. Their gray hulls faded, their names worn down by salt and time. And yet, the sound of their engines still lingered in the hearts of those who had built them. It was the sound of purpose, the sound of hands that had turned fear into endurance. By the end of 1945, the Liberty Fleet had done what no army could. It had conquered distance itself, bridging continents, feeding nations, and carrying the weight of peace. One worker, interviewed years later, said, "We never thought of it as history. We just thought, Someone needed a ship, and we knew how to make one. That was their legacy. Quiet, unrecorded, indelible. They built not for medals, but for the promise that tomorrow would come on time. As night fell over the bay once more, a lone whistle sounded from an idle crane. It echoed through the empty sheds, through rusted railings and broken timbers. The wind picked up from the water, carrying that sound toward the horizon, where the last Liberty ship still moved, slow and steady, into a world finally at peace. And in the distance, as fog rolled in over the quiet yard, a single lamp still burned in the window of the old foreman's office. Its light trembled against the glass, a faint reminder of all that had been built and all that had been believed. The war was over, but its rhythm remained, quiet, steady, like the pulse of an engine cooling in the dark. In every harbor, Liberty ships rested at anchor. Some waited for cargo that would never come. Others rusted where they had served, their decks empty except for gulls and silence. The shipyards that once blazed with light grew still under the California fog. Sparks no longer danced through the night, but the glow lingered, inside the people who built them. Henry Kaiser stood on a platform in Richmond in 1946, addressing a smaller crowd than before. He spoke not of ships or deadlines, but of what the work had meant. These ships, he said, were more than steel. They were the faith of a free people, forged when freedom was at risk. Around him stood the welders, clerks, drivers, and nurses who had once lived by the sound of hammers. Their faces were older, but their eyes still carried the reflection of firelight. Kaiser's next vision was not made of hulls, it was made of healing. The hospitals he founded for his workers became the foundation of a new kind of care, one built on prevention, equality, and trust. He had learned that the same systems which could build ships in days could also build health, homes, and hope. It was still construction, only now it was of the human spirit. Many Liberty ships sailed on into the 1950s. Some were sold, some repurposed, a few preserved as floating museums. Their steel carried stories, the names of welders etched beneath layers of paint, the fingerprints of men and women who had welded history together in secret. When visitors step aboard the Jeremiah O'Brien today, they still hear the hum of its engines, the same rhythm that once crossed the Atlantic in fog and fear, a heartbeat of industry, beating still for memory. In time, the Liberty ship became a symbol of something deeper, not speed, but unity. Proof that when an entire nation believes in a single purpose, impossible timetables become testaments of will. Historians call it the arsenal of democracy. Those who were there called it simply the job. But beneath every statistic lies a truth the numbers can't hold, that courage is not always found in battle, but in the quiet endurance of creation. At sunset, the bay still catches light in the ripples where those ships once launched. The wind carries the faint sound of cranes, and the smell of salt and oil lingers, as if the past still breathes beneath the water. They fought not to be remembered, but so others could forget the fear, and in that forgetting, in that hard-earned peace, the legacy of liberty endures.